She loved him, but he carried a dark secret. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you thought nothing could ever shake the bond you shared? It's a beautiful thing, that kind of love. The kind where you trust without questioning, where you dream about forever together, where even the hard days feel worth it because you know you're not facing them alone. That's exactly how Emma felt when she met Daniel. From the very first moment, he seemed different, kind, attentive, the type of man who listened with his whole heart. Emma had been through enough in life to know that real connection wasn't something you stumbled upon every day. And so when she found it, she clung to it. Maybe you know that feeling too. That sense of finding something precious, something you've prayed for, something you believe God himself might have woven into your path. Daniel had this quiet strength about him, the kind of presence that made Emma feel safe, even on the worst days. He remembered the little things she said, showed up when he promised he would, and treated her with a tenderness that felt almost too good to be true. And maybe that's where it started, that little whisper inside Emma's heart, that tiny thread of fear she chose to ignore because she wanted so badly to believe in the goodness she saw. Love has a way of covering flaws, doesn't it? Sometimes that's beautiful, and sometimes it's dangerous. The first time she noticed something, odd, it was small. Daniel canceled a dinner date with no real explanation, just a quick, vague text. No big deal, she told herself. Everyone has busy days. But then it happened again, and again, always with a softness in his voice, always with just enough kindness that it didn't feel like abandonment. Just life. Emma, being who she was, always gave him grace. That's what love does, after all. It chooses to believe the best. It hopes all things, bears all things. But as time went on, the gaps between them started to grow wider, not from anything visible, but from the things Daniel didn't say. The silence between the words, the spaces where honesty should have lived. Emma believed in prayer. She believed that when something felt wrong, it wasn't just paranoia. It was the Holy Spirit whispering, gently tugging, urging her to pay attention. But she also knew how easy it was to confuse fear with discernment. So she prayed harder. She asked God for wisdom, for patience, for clarity. She reminded herself that love is not easily angered, that it keeps no record of wrongs. She told herself that everyone carries a past, that grace was the soil where new beginnings could grow. And so she stayed. She stayed through the odd excuses, the quiet sadness she couldn't name, the feeling that Daniel was fighting a battle he wasn't ready to share. Then came the night when everything shifted. They were sitting together on the porch, watching. The sun dipped below the trees, wrapped in one of those comfortable silences that only deep familiarity brings. Emma leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, and said the words that had been burning in her heart for weeks. "I feel like you're carrying something heavy," she whispered. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready, but I just want you to know you don't have to carry it alone." Daniel stiffened beneath her. Not much, just a slight tightening of his muscles, but enough that she felt it. Enough that she knew she had touched something raw and wounded. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared out into the fading light, as if searching for the courage to speak. And when he finally did, his voice was so quiet Emma had to strain to hear it. "There's a part of me I've never wanted you to see," he said. "A part I wish didn't exist." He paused, swallowed hard. "Because if you see it, I'm afraid you'll leave." Emma's heart cracked open at his vulnerability. She squeezed his hand, silently urging him to go on. Because love doesn't turn away from brokenness. It leans in. Daniel took a deep breath and finally began to tell her the story he had buried deep inside. A story of mistakes, of shame, of a past he had spent years trying to outrun. As he spoke, Emma listened. She listened not just with her ears, but with her whole being. She heard the regret woven into every word, felt the sorrow that clung to him like a second skin. And with every piece he revealed, she realized how complicated love really is. It's one thing to love someone's goodness, It's another thing entirely to love their wounds, their failures, their darkest chapters. When he finally finished, Daniel turned to her with eyes full of fear, bracing for the rejection he was sure would come. And in that moment, Emma faced a choice. The kind of choice that defines who we are, the kind that echoes through the rest of our lives. She could walk away, protect her own heart from the risk of future pain, or she could stay, knowing full well that loving someone means sometimes walking with them through shadows you wish you never had to see. And maybe that's what real love is. Not the fairy tale, not the perfect happily ever after, but the daily decision to see someone fully, flaws and all, and still choose them. Emma reached out, cupped his face in her hands, and said words that even surprised herself in their certainty. "You're not your past," she whispered. "You are who you are today. And I love you." Daniel broke down then, all the walls he had built so carefully crumbling in an instant. He cried not the quiet, restrained tears of someone trying to stay composed, but the deep, body-shaking sobs of a man who had been holding pain inside for too long. Emma held him, not saying a word, letting her arms speak what words could not. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply showing up and staying when someone is at their most unlovable. That night changed everything between them, though not in the ways Emma had expected. It didn't erase the darkness of Daniel's past. It didn't magically heal the scars he carried, but it did something deeper. It created a space where honesty could finally breathe, where shame had no choice but to loosen its grip. The days that followed weren't easy. In fact, they were harder in some ways. Now that the truth was out in the open, Emma had to wrestle with questions she'd never faced before. Could she really build a future with someone who had lived through such brokenness? Could she trust that the man Daniel had become was stronger than the mistakes he had made? Some nights she lay awake staring at the ceiling, heart heavy with the weight of it all. It's one thing to say you'll love someone through anything. It's another thing to live it out when the reality is messier than you imagined. And Daniel struggled too. There were moments when the old shame would rise up like a ghost he couldn't quite outrun. Times when he would pull away, convinced that if Emma truly understood the depths of his failures, she would change her mind. But Emma wasn't going anywhere. She had made a choice, and love, real love, sticks by its choices. That doesn't mean she ignored the hard parts or pretended they didn't matter. It just meant she chose to see the whole story, not just the chapters that were easy to read. They started having conversations they should have had long before. Honest, painful, beautiful conversations about forgiveness, about trust, about how the past shapes us but doesn't have to define us. Daniel opened up about the decisions that had led him down dark paths, about the people he had hurt and the ways he had hurt himself. Emma listened with a heart that wanted to understand, not to excuse, but to see. And every time she chose to stay, she helped Daniel believe a little more in the possibility of redemption. One evening, they sat across from each other at the little kitchen table Emma had found at a second-hand store, a table scratched and worn but still standing, still beautiful in its own way. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. His voice trembled as he said, "You deserve better than me." Emma squeezed his hand tighter, tears burning her eyes. "Maybe," she said with a small smile, "but better isn't about spotless histories. Better is about who you choose to be now." There's a powerful truth hidden in that moment, one we all need to remember. No one's past is clean. We all carry things we wish we could forget, moments we wish we could rewrite. But grace, real grace, says that who you are today matters more than who you used to be. It says that your future isn't chained to your failures. In Romans 8:1 it says, "There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." Emma believed that with her whole heart, and she was determined to live it out, not just for herself, but for Daniel too. As the weeks turned into months, they built something new together. It wasn't a fairy tale. It didn't come with guarantees. There were hard conversations, old fears that resurfaced, moments when trust had to be fought for all over again. But there was also laughter, deep friendship, and the kind of love that isn't based on illusions but on truth. Emma learned that loving someone doesn't mean ignoring their brokenness. It means standing in the middle of it and choosing to be a light. And Daniel learned that he was still worthy of love, not because he had earned it, but because grace makes a way where shame tries to build walls.
There was a night, months later, when Daniel surprised her with a simple picnic at the park where they had first met. No grand gestures, no elaborate plans, just a blanket, some sandwiches, and the two of them sitting under the stars. As they lay there, Daniel turned to her with a look she hadn't seen before, a look not of fear, but of peace. "I used to believe I was beyond saving," he whispered, "but you showed me that God wasn't finished with me yet." Emma smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the night air. "He's never finished," she said, "and neither are we." In that moment, everything made sense. All the hard days, the tough conversations, the moments of doubt, they had been building toward this, toward a love that was real, messy, beautiful, and fiercely alive, toward a future that wasn't defined by where they had been, but by where they were willing to go together. Sometimes, life doesn't hand you a perfect story wrapped in a neat bow. Sometimes it hands you a broken, beautiful mosaic and asks if you're brave enough to build something sacred out of it. Emma and Daniel were saying yes, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one small act of faith at a time. The seasons shifted slowly, and with them, so did Emma and Daniel's story. They weren't racing toward anything anymore. They had learned the beauty of slow and steady, the sacredness of small beginnings. Every morning, Daniel woke up and chose her. Every evening, Emma thanked God for second chances. Not just for Daniel, but for herself too. Because loving someone through their healing does something surprising. It heals parts of you that you didn't even realize were wounded. It calls you to forgive, to let go, to believe in redemption in ways you might not have dared to before. Not every day was easy, and they never pretended otherwise. There were arguments, moments of insecurity that bubbled up from old wounds, days when the weight of the past felt heavier than usual. But they faced it together now. They had learned that real love doesn't mean the absence of struggle. It means choosing to work through the struggle side by side. Ecclesiastes 4:9-10 says, "Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up." Emma and Daniel lived that out in the everyday messiness of real life, not in grand declarations, but in simple, faithful acts of showing up. There was a particular afternoon that stood out in Emma's mind long after it passed. Daniel had gotten some hard news about a family member he hadn't spoken to in years, someone tied to the worst parts of his past. The weight of it pulled him under quickly, and for the first time in a long time, she saw the old darkness flicker behind his eyes. Instead of shrinking away like he once would have, Daniel came to her. He sat down on the worn couch they both loved, his hands shaking slightly. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma reached out without hesitation, resting her hand over his. "You don't have to face this alone," she said, her voice steady, even though her own heart trembled for him. That moment mattered more than any of the easy, happy ones ever could have. Healing isn't a straight line, and sometimes We need reminders that falling back doesn't mean failing completely. It just means you're still human. And if someone is willing to hold you through the setbacks, to remind you of who you are, when you can't see it for yourself, that's the kind of love that changes everything. It was on days like that when Emma realized love was less about finding someone who completed you and more about finding someone willing to walk with you as you both became more whole. And slowly, Daniel began to change in ways neither of them could have predicted. The man who once believed he wasn't worthy of anything good started mentoring younger men at their church, sharing pieces of his story in quiet conversations over coffee, not from a place of pride, but from a place of raw, humble honesty. He wasn't trying to pretend he had it all figured out. He was simply offering what he had, proof that broken things could still be used for good. Romans 8:28 echoed in his heart louder than ever before. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Watching Daniel step into that calling was one of the greatest joys of Emma's life. Not because she had fixed him, she knew now that no one can fix another person, but because she had witnessed the slow, breathtaking work of God's grace unfolding in real time, grace that didn't erase the past, but redeemed it, grace that didn't demand perfection, but simply asked for surrender, grace that took a story marked by shame and pain and wove it into something unexpectedly beautiful. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted their tiny backyard in gold and rose hues, Daniel pulled Emma close and asked her a question that made her heart skip. Would you build a life with me? Not just a future, but a whole life. One filled with the messy, glorious ups and downs they had already tasted together. Emma didn't need time to think. She had already made her choice 1,000 small times before that moment. She smiled through tears and whispered, I already am. Love isn't about finding someone without scars. It's about finding someone whose broken pieces you're willing to hold tenderly, knowing you have your own as well. It's about recognizing that real beauty often rises from ashes, that real strength is forged in fire, and that real love is built, not found. It's the daily choice to stay, to forgive, to believe in the work that healing requires. It's saying yes, even when fear whispers all the reasons you should run. It's choosing hope over history, grace over guilt, and faith over fear. Emma and Daniel's story wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was real, and real was more than enough. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but they also knew they weren't walking it alone. Not only did they have each other, they had a God who specializes in bringing beauty from brokenness, light from darkness, life from death. That promise was stitched into every step they took, into every new beginning they dared to believe in. So if you're holding someone's hand today, or maybe wishing you had the courage to, remember this. Love isn't about avoiding the hard stories. It's about writing a new ending together, one filled with grace, with growth, and with the kind of hope that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances, but on a perfect God who is always, always working for good. Seasons changed. Again, as they always do, the storms that once seemed so overwhelming eventually softened into rain that made the garden of their lives grow richer and deeper. Emma and Daniel found joy in simple things: the slow brewing of coffee in the mornings, the evening walks, where they didn't have to say much at all because their hearts were already speaking the same language. They learned that healing doesn't just fix what's broken, it builds something entirely new, something even stronger than before. It's not about forgetting the past, but allowing it to teach you how to love better, how to live fuller, how to hold tighter to the things that matter. One rainy Saturday, Daniel sat by the window, strumming his old guitar, the one he hadn't touched since before everything fell apart. Emma watched him from across the room, feeling a lump rise in her throat. It wasn't about the music, it was about the way he carried himself now. Lighter, freer, no longer a prisoner of the shame he once wore like a heavy coat. It struck her how far they had come, how far God had carried them. Psalm 147:3 whispered through her heart, "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." She had seen it with her own eyes. She was living it. And while the darkness of Daniel's past would always be a part of his story, it no longer defined him. It had been transformed into a testimony, not a sentence. The very things that once threatened to destroy him had become the bridges that connected him to others who needed hope. Emma sometimes marveled at how God can take the darkest chapters of a person's life and, with his gentle hands, weave them into a masterpiece of grace. There was a quiet courage in Daniel now, a kind of strength that comes only from walking through fire and coming out the other side. He wasn't fearless. No one ever truly is. But he had learned to move forward in spite of fear. That, Emma realized, was the truest kind of bravery. And she had her own scars too, wounds from loving someone who was still learning to love himself. But those scars were no longer tender. They were reminders of how deep love can go when it's rooted not in fantasy, but in the messy, breathtaking reality of grace. One night, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars blink alive one by one, Daniel took Emma's hand and said something she would never forget. "You loved me when I couldn't love myself. You saw who I could be, even when I couldn't see it. But more than that, you pointed me back to the one who loved me first." His voice cracked a little, and Emma squeezed his hand, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. That was the secret, wasn't it? It had never been about fixing each other or saving each other. It had always been about leading each other back to the only one who truly saves. As the months turned into years, their life together was far from perfect, but it was rich, full of laughter, of hard conversations, of forgiveness offered again and again, full of the kind of peace that doesn't come from having an easy life, but from knowing that you are deeply loved even when life is hard. They built a home not out of flawless moments, but out of thousands of ordinary, faithful choices to stay, to believe, to hope. And in those walls, there was freedom. Freedom to be real. Freedom to be broken sometimes. Freedom to be loved anyway. Emma often thought back to the early days when everything felt so uncertain, when Daniel's secret threatened to shatter everything. She realized now that it wasn't the absence of pain that made a love story beautiful. It was the way love endured through the pain. It was the way forgiveness stitched together what the world said should be torn apart. It was the way grace made room for redemption where only regret once lived. And if someone asked Emma today if she ever regretted loving Daniel, She would smile softly and shake her head, because loving him had taught her more about the heart of God than anything else ever could. It taught her about mercy that never runs out, about hope that refuses to die, about the fierce, steady love that doesn't quit when things get messy. It taught her that sometimes the most beautiful stories aren't the ones without scars. They're the ones where scars become sacred. Their journey wasn't a fairy tale, not in the traditional sense. It didn't tie up neatly with a bow. There were still days when old fears tried to creep in, still moments when they had to choose trust over suspicion, faith over fear. But that was part of the beauty, the ongoing, ever unfolding redemption that only God can write. And every single day, they made the decision to keep writing that story together, one imperfect, grace filled chapter at a time.